Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the Every Student Succeeds Act, What It Is and How You Can Take Action. I'm Amanda Hooper from the National Women's Law Center, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. We have just a few technical notes before we begin the presentations. First, all lines will be on mute during the webinar. We will be taking questions after the experts are finished with their presentations, but you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the function on your webinar toolbar. We will also be recording the webinar, and you will receive a link to the recording of the presentation as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides within the next few days. We have three presenters today. The first is Adaku Onyeka-Crawford, who is counsel at the National Women's Law Center. Next, we'll hear from Adam Fernandez, who is legislative attorney at the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And then finally, Matt Ferranti, who is legislative director at the National Indian Education Association. Before we start the presentations, we'd like to quickly get a better idea of who is on the webinar with us today. So I'm going to launch a poll question that you should be seeing pop up on your screen shortly. So it looks like the poll is up. Which one of these best describes you, especially as it relates to what brought you to this webinar? You can select one or as many as apply. The options that are up there are parent, teacher, local advocate, national advocate, or a school administrator. So we will just give it a few more seconds to folks to weigh in. It looks like about 86% of the people who are on have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and just close the poll at this point. So we had 83% national advocates, 25% local advocates, and 8% parents, with 0% teachers and school administrators. And then we have one more poll question, which I will launch now, which is, how familiar are you with the Every Student Succeeds Act? Are you not at all familiar? This is the first you're hearing of it or learning about it. Not very familiar, somewhat familiar, or very familiar. And again, I'll give it a few more seconds for folks to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. It looks like 23% are not at all familiar. 15% are not very familiar, 38% are somewhat familiar, and 23% are very familiar. So thank you so much, everyone, for weighing in on the polls to give us a better idea of who is with us today. And at this point, I will turn over the floor to Adaku from the National Women's Law Center. So Adaku, I'm going to make you the presenter so you can share your screen.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Adaku Onyeka-Crawford, and I'm counsel for education at the National Women's Law Center. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, the Every Student Succeeds Act and What It Is, How You Can Take Action. So first, before we get into the webinar, I want to give you a brief outline of what to expect today. So first, we're going to talk about the history and background of the Every Student Succeeds Act, when it was first enacted and how it's evolved throughout the years and how we ended up with the law that was signed into law by President Barack Obama last year. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the proposed rules that the Department of Education issued in May of this year. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reporting requirements under the proposed rules, as well as resource equity requirements under the proposed rules. Then I'm going to hand it over to Adam Fernandez at MALDEF, and he's going to talk about accountability provisions in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then he's going to hand that off to Matt Ferranti, and he will talk about parental and community engagement provisions, as well as how you can comment and stay engaged locally. And then we'll open it up to a question and answer session at the end. So first, let's start with the history of what was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So isESSA was enacted in 1965, and so there's a picture of the bill signing with President Johnson. And the reason it was enacted was because 10 years after Brown via the Board of Education, which said that separate separate and equal was unequal on its face, state and local educational agencies still weren't paying attention to the needs of students who attended low-income schools and predominantly schools that were attended by students of color. And so the federal Congress and federal agencies discovered that, they decided that without federal involvement, it was clear that the needs of economically disadvantaged students and students of color would go unaddressed. So Congress passed ESEA to give much needed federal funds to disadvantaged students. And it's evolved throughout the years to include other historically disadvantaged students, such as students with disabilities and English language learners. And today it's the federal government's biggest investment in K-12 education. So it's really important to remember the civil rights history of the ESEA. So in 2002, ESEA became No Child Left Behind. And the goal of No Child Left Behind was to ensure all students graduate high school ready for college and career. Now I know folks have probably heard about No Child Left Behind, and we're going to go to a little bit more detail about why it had to be reauthorized. But first I want to talk about the method that No Child Left Behind took to try and ensure that goal, that every student is ready for college and career. So under No Child Left Behind, schools that received funds had to administer tests annually in grades 1 through 8 and once in high school. So you would be able to track student progress on an annual basis rather than every 3 years or 5 years, which was what was happening beforehand. And also, schools that received federal funds had to make annual yearly progress, which is abbreviated as AYP, in test scores and grad rates. So I'm sure folks have heard about No Child Left Behind in a kind of a negative light, and there was a lot that needed to be corrected. But first I want to talk a little bit about the pros of No Child Left Behind. So one of the things that NCLB did was, for the first time, it disaggregated, which is a big spooky word, but really just means like segmented test scores and graduation rates by what are called subgroups. And these subgroups included like race, sex, disability, English proficiency, economic status, whether a student has free or reduced price lunch, and migrant status. And so for the first time ever, you were able to look at achievement gaps between, for example, white students and black students, or students who have limited English proficiency and students who are English proficient, and see like whether or not there were achievement gaps between these groups of students. And once these gaps were exposed, schools had a duty to close them for subgroups of children and thus lift achievement for all students. Another pro of No Child Left Behind is that schools were held accountable for the performance of these disadvantaged subgroups, and specifically students of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, and socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And historically, ESA funding did not ask schools to increase performance, so it's kind of just kind of like a blank check. And so No Child Left Behind attempted to get school districts to actually improve achievement for these historically disadvantaged groups of children. Unfortunately, the way that they went about it was not the best way possible. So first of all, there were unrealistic expectations. So in law, No Child Left Behind said that every student needed to be proficient on assessments by the 2013 and 2014 school year, which, you know, nobody's perfect. No school system is perfect, so why would we put a perfect goal mark? So that was the first problem. Another problem was that the benchmarks were rigid, and the penalties for missing those benchmarks were really tough and stringent. So the federal government set annual yearly progress that needed to be made, and if schools failed to make AYP multiple years in a row, there were tough sanctions that were kind of threatened, so replacing staff and restructuring school. And so because AYP was measured by test scores, there was increased scrutiny and increased work on making sure that students performed well on tests. And so this created an environment of high-stakes testing and teaching to the test rather than having a well-rounded education. And then the third thing that No Child Left Behind erred in is there just weren't any resources to implement the law. So Congress didn't fund the law at levels that would be appropriate for states to implement measures that would allow them to meet AYP. And then once schools failed to meet AYP, students were given the option to transfer out of schools, and that also deprived schools of funding needed to improve as well. So those were the problems with No Child Left Behind, and by 2015, it was very apparent that there needed to be a rewrite and there needed to be another overhaul of the isESSA. And so in 2015, No Child Left Behind became the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Every Student Succeeds Act kind of builds upon the good reporting and transparency measures in No Child Left Behind. And it also urges states to look at gaps in resources for struggling schools. So rather than dealing out sanctions, there's support for schools that miss benchmarks or are struggling to teach students. It also gives states, schools, parents, and communities some flexibility in setting the goals and making plans to boost achievement. So under No Child Left Behind, the federal government sets the standards, the benchmarks, and also action to take if those benchmarks weren't met. Under Every Student Succeeds Act, local states, parents, communities come up with the benchmarks, and they also come up with the plans to boost achievement if they miss those benchmarks. And it also requires more parental and community engagement. Again, No Child Left Behind, while there were provisions that encourage community engagement, ESSA is much more intentional in that. And the most important thing is that ESSA preserves the federal role in education through rulemaking and other mechanisms. So like I said, the Every Student Succeeds Act builds on isESSA, which was a civil rights law that recognized that unless the federal government looks out for disadvantaged students, there's a possibility that their needs might be unaddressed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rulemaking process, but first I want to give an overview of what that is. So I have the Schoolhouse Rocks bill becoming a law, but we don't really talk about what happens after a bill becomes a law. What happens is that the federal government issues rules. So once a bill becomes a law, the federal government has the duty and the ability to enforce it. So in the case of ESSA, the Department of Education would be the federal agency that enforces that law. And usually enforcement happens through what's called the rulemaking process. And so what happens is the federal government puts out a proposed rule, and the Department of Education did that on May 31st with ESSA. And the public has a chance to comment on it because we're a democracy, and we believe that we should have a say in the laws that are created that we have to follow. And after the public has a chance to comment on it, the agency reviews those comments and then takes them into account and then issues a final rule that entities must follow. So Matt will talk a little bit later about how you can get involved in the rulemaking process. But first, let's talk about the proposed rules that the department put out on May 31st. So I'm going to talk about reporting and resource equity. So again, looking back at No Child Left Behind, again, they had great reporting on test scores and grad rates by race, gender, disability, English proficiency, economic status, and migrant status. And that's great, but it doesn't really give a full picture of what school quality looks like. ESSA reporting does give a fuller picture, and there are several new categories of reporting that are required under ESSA. So for example, rates of school discipline and other measures of school climate such as harassment, bullying, and other things that kind of gauge school climate. Schools are also required to report on resources, so access to pre-kindergarten classes, access to advanced placement classes, and experienced teachers. Also, something that we're very excited about as the National Women's Law Center is ESSA requires intersectional student data. And so what we mean by intersectional is, students can fall into more than one category. So you can be Latino and also a girl. And under NCLB, those are siloed. So you got the data for all Latino students and all girls, but you couldn't look at the cross-section at, for example, Latina girls. So ESSA fixes that problem by requiring schools to report that information. So we're very excited about that. ESSA also requires per pupil expenditures. There's a whole list of things that ESSA requires reporting on that gives a fuller picture of schools and what they're using federal resources on. And so I encourage you to check out some of our resources that highlight all the reporting provisions in ESSA. So let's talk about the proposed rule for school reporting. So this is as much detail. I try to also make it detailed, but also give a high-level overview so we can follow up on certain things. So first, I'm going to break this into what's required for what's called the state report card and the local educational agency report card or school district report card. So the SEA report card, because there's so much information that is now required, we don't want folks to get lost. And so the department is saying that for the SEA report card, there needs to be an overview section. So what this is just provides a snapshot on how the school is doing on really important measures. And so the SEA report card overview needs to have state-level data that's in the state's accountability system by race, disability, English proficiency, and economic status. Now, Adam will talk about what needs to be in the accountability system, but basically, to give you a shorthand overview, it's what the state deems is important for preparing students for college and career. So that's what needs to be in the report card overview for the state report card. In addition, the proposed rule says that the state educational website must have a full report card with the overview section, as well as each local educational agency's report card. So the state educational agency website needs to have all the information about all the educational agencies within the state and how they're doing in meeting their goals. And it also needs to have the school districts that have been identified as needing additional support. And finally, the state report card proposed rule says that report cards must be made available by December 31st of the following school year. So for example, for the 2017-2018 report card, it must be up by before 2018 closes. And so that's the proposed rule for the state report card. For the LEA report card, it's very similar. So they also need to have an overview section that also has district and school level data by the 4 subgroups that are required in the SEA report card. But in addition, the LEA report card has to state how that school district compares to the rest of the state, as well as how schools compare within the LEA or school district and state. So this information is useful because if I'm a parent and I send my child to my local school district, I want to be able to see how my school district compares with other school districts in the states, as well as how my school stacks up within the school district and also within the state. So this is really useful information for parents and also advocates. It also requires the report card to have the rating for each school. So different states will have different rating systems. Some have like A to F rating systems, or 4 stars or 5 stars. So they have to explain their rating system as well as say how that school rates. And whether a school has been identified for needing additional support is also required in the overview section. The proposed rule also says that if a school district has a website, they need to publish the report card there. And it also says that the district has to give the overview directly to parents, either via mail or email, because not every parent is going to go to the website, but they should have this information. And even for LEAs that don't have websites, they have to find some way to disseminate their report card to the public. And they have the same deadline as the state report card. So December 31st of the following school year. And so that's the proposed rules for state and LEA report cards. And we have a couple of suggestions for ways to improve the proposed report card. So I have this picture of this paywall, which is annoying whenever we see it in real life. And some states actually do use this to provide access to individuals. So the first thing that we recommend to improve the proposed rules to ensure that all reporting info is easily accessible. So the proposed rule actually has written into it that parents need to be able to access this information even if there is like a language accessibility issue or disability accessibility issue. We would propose that that broadens not just to parents but everybody, the public, advocates, community members, school leaders should all have access to the information. And even if there isn't a disability or language access issues, the SEA shouldn't restrict access by requiring a login or fee or any kind of barrier to access this information. We also recommend that we expand the overview categories of students, so to include by sex and youth in foster care. This is information that's newly collected under ESSA, and so we feel, especially for students according to sex, that this information would be useful in the overview section and give a great snapshot. Another recommendation we have is to make state report cards user-friendly, so allowing parents and advocates to easily compare across schools and districts. So that's in the local agent, the LEA report card allows for that comparison within the district and to the state. But there's not necessarily a mechanism that requires someone to just go to the state website and be able to compare across local LEAs and across schools. So making that a little bit easier to compare LEA to LEA without having to actually go to the website of the LEA. And we think this prevents creating silos between school districts as well. So those are our recommendations for improving the proposed rule for report cards. I also want to talk a little bit about N size and why that matters. So to give you guys a really brief overview about what N size is, it's the minimum amount of students required within a subgroup to be counted for accountability or reporting. What does that mean? So I'll give you an example. So if a state sets an N size of 20, a school with 18 English language learners in the 3rd grade wouldn't have to report or track that data for those students. And so because they don't meet the benchmark of 20. And so setting a high N size can erase whole groups of students from reporting and the accountability system. And the threat is even greater for students who fall into multiple categories and face multiple barriers. So for example, girls of color or economically disadvantaged students with disabilities. And to give you an even better example, so in 2012, Mississippi lowered its N size from 40 to 30 students. And when they did that, the number of schools that had students with disabilities for accountability purposes went from 234 to 872. And then the number of schools with English language learners increased from 15 to 447. And so this is really important for making sure that all students count and all students are counted in accountability systems. So lower N size is better than a higher N size because it makes sure that all students count. So the current range of state N sizes varies from 5 to 50. And the proposed rule to kind of limit higher N sizes caps N size at 30. And we think this is too high. As we can see from Mississippi, that N size that varies within even 10 points has a big difference on how many students are identified. So our suggestion is to cap N size at 10. As you can see, there are still schools that have it as low as 5. The National Center for Education Statistics approves this, and they say that that's a sufficiently low enough N size to capture a lot of students, but also protect student privacy. So that's our recommendation for N size. And then finally, I'm going to talk very quickly about resource equity. So what is resource equity? It's really simple. It just says that schools that need the more resources should get more resources than wealthier school districts. And resources are a very broad term. So I have books and old computers there, but it can also mean qualified teachers, access to pre-K, availability of trained paraprofessionals like nurses and librarians, and also the use of discipline and referrals to law enforcement. And so we don't have any recommendations yet for resource equity, but we will walk you through what is in the proposed rule. So in the proposed rule, resource equity provisions apply only to schools that have been identified as in need of additional support. And so once a school is identified, the LEA has to address and identify resource inequities in the rates of out-of-field inexperienced or ineffective teachers and per pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds. So how much a school district is spending for pupils for students per student using federal, state, and local funds. And the proposed rule also says an LEA may identify, so they don't have to, but they can at their own discretion, and address resource inequities in access to advanced coursework, pre-kindergarten programs, and instructional materials and technology. And also there are targeted support schools and comprehensive support schools that Adam will talk about a little bit more. But for targeted support schools, they also need to do a needs assessment, and they can also identify and address resource equities in that needs assessment. So that's a lot of information, and I hope to look forward to some of your questions at the end. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to talk about accountability in ESSA.
Great, thank you, Adaku, and thank you to the National Women's Law Center for having this and inviting me to participate in it. So again, my name is Adam Fernandez, and I'm a legislative attorney at MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Over the past year and a half, we've focused on accountability in ESSA. This has been our #1 priority, but I'm going to do my absolute best to keep it down to 12 minutes in this presentation. So a year and a half to 12 minutes. I know that's an awful lot of compression, so feel free to ask questions either in your chat box, and also at the end of this presentation, you'll have my email address. Feel free to reach out to me by email as well. So I wanted to go back very briefly to the purpose of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Really, this is a civil rights bill passed in the civil rights era, along with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. ESEA's mission is to give equal educational opportunities to students of color, economically disadvantaged students, and later on were added students with disabilities and English learners. Now, accountability is how we try to enforce that mission. Now, it's changed a bit from No Child Left Behind to ESSA. With your help, this change will be for the better. So Adaku mentioned the proposed regulations that are out and currently out for public comment and due August 1st. And Matt Ferranti, my friend over at NIEA, will be discussing this a little bit more in our next section. So in addition to those federal comments, you'll also have opportunities for state and local input, and I'll get into that a bit, as will Matt in the next section. So I wanted to briefly say what we'll be discussing in the accountability system. First, Adaku mentioned it briefly, subgroups. For accountability purposes, these are groups of kids who need to independently do well. It's important to emphasize this because that's one thing that has not changed between No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act. Next, we're going to discuss indicators, those measures of schools which are no longer just one high-stakes test like they were in No Child Left Behind. Third, we'll discuss school identification, those measures of school performance, which is not any longer a simple pass or fail. And finally, we'll discuss supports and interventions, those school improvement plans, which should be targeted at underperforming subgroups. So first, Adaku mentioned subgroups, and For accountability purposes, this is really important. These are groups of kids who need to independently do well. These include students from major racial and ethnic groups, such as white, Latino, African American, Asian American, Native American, also economically disadvantaged students as measured by access to or free and reduced price lunch, also children with disabilities and English learners. So each of these groups needs to independently do well. It was true in No Child Left Behind, true in Every Student Succeeds Act, because this is the purpose of the law, to make sure that these kids are getting access to an equal and quality education. So we've talked about how the systems are similar. Now I'm going to talk about how they're different. Under No Child Left Behind, you had essentially one indicator, an assessment or test. Graduation rates in high school were added a little later on through regulations, but put that aside. Under the elementary, or excuse me, after ESSA was passed in December of last year, we have at least 4 indicators, which I'll get into in a moment. Next, goals. As Adaku mentioned, we had the goal in No Child Left Behind was 100% proficiency for all subgroups. That was a federally determined goal. Now under ESSA, we have state-determined goal, which must take into account the need for accelerated improvement for subgroups who are further behind. Because it is state-determined, there is also an opportunity for you to, excuse me, for you to reach out, for you to have your voice heard, and again, Matt will discuss how a little later on. Finally, you had that timeline. Under No Child Left Behind, you had not only a goal of 100% proficiency, but a goal that proficiency should happen by 2014. Under ESSA, the timeline is state determined. So again, opportunity for you to have your voice heard, to get the timeline that and goal that works best to get equal access for our kids. Next, indicators. Again, measuring schools is no longer just one high-stakes test. Under ESSA, there are at least 4 indicators. First, tests like under No Child Left Behind. You've got tests in math, in English language arts, once, as the document mentioned, once 3 through 8 and once in high school. And you also have tests in science, which get a little less attention, but they are once per grade span, essentially elementary, middle, and high school. Additionally, a second indicator. Now, there's always been assessment of English learners, but the second indicator in ESSA is moving these tests that we had before into the accountability system to require that schools with English learners and districts are held responsible for how well those English learners are doing on their assessment of English proficiency. So this is another very important reason why N-size is important, because if the number of English learners doesn't reach a state's N-size, as Adaku mentioned, then it will essentially be as though there are no English learners in that state, that school, and therefore the proficiency of English learners will not be considered worth going after. And it's in the accountability system, which is one more reason why MALDEF also supports as low an N size as possible, such as 10. Third indicator is separated by grade span. In high school, you've got those graduation rates. And in elementary and middle schools, you've got another academic indicator. Another academic indicator sounds pretty broad. Another great opportunity for you to reach out. This is going to be state determined, and your input is necessary, and hopefully we'll be able to get our voices heard. And finally, the fourth indicator is one or more indicators of, quote, school quality or academic success. Also very broad, also state determined, also your input is very important. Finally, weighting and brief. So under No Child Left Behind, you just had tests. So essentially 100% of the system was tests. Now, under Every Student Succeeds Act, you have at least 4 indicators. I'm not going to go into the specifics on, there's a few statutory languages around indicator weighting, But long story short, there's whatever happens in the regulations, there'll be some opportunity for wiggle room with those 4 indicators, what percentages we have. So it's up to you on the state and local level, or excuse me, on the state level, to make sure that the weighting is best set to educate our kids. And I do say at the state level because these indicators have to be statewide according to the law. Next, school identification. Again, school performance is no longer a simple pass or fail. Under Every Student Succeeds Act, there are 3 tiers. First, targeted support schools. Schools where subgroups aren't doing well. Many, including myself, call these the achievement gap schools, but they even apply even if all the subgroups are doing equally poorly. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a gap if all the subgroups are doing poorly, including the white subgroup. So second tier, the, quote, additional targeted support schools. Schools where one or more subgroups is doing as poorly as the bottom 5 worst schools in the state. These are what I call the bad achievement gap schools. If you're a subgroup who isn't doing well in that school, you might as well be in the worst school in the state. Third, the comprehensive support schools. Now there's 3 types of these. They're the bottom 5 worst schools in the state. There are also a separate type of comprehensive support school, high schools with graduation rates below 67%. In other words, they're not graduating at least a third of their students. Pretty bad. And finally, you have the second tier, additional targeted support schools after a period of time. Period of time vague. The proposed regs try to cap that at 3 years. Even if it is capped at 3 years, I think all of us as civil rights advocates would like that to be as short a period of time as possible. So additional targeted support schools is another great opportunity for you to have your voice heard. Next, supports and interventions. These school improvement plans should be targeted at underperforming subgroups. Now, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, if a school isn't doing well, it requires stakeholder input, that is your input, in determining school improvement plans, and Matt will get into that in a moment. It also requires that the supports and interventions be evidence-based to solve the issue which caused the school to be identified. So like that was, as Dr. mentioned, one of the sort of problems with No Child Left Behind, that these were high-stakes tests. And under Every Student Succeeds Act, it's no longer just tests. And I'd argue it's also less high stakes because with your help, those supports and interventions, where before it was just interventions, they could do a much better job of targeting these supports to the subgroups who need it, as opposed to having a school-wide issue that ignores the problem. And finally, resource disparities. Now, it's very important to mention that Adaku was talking about resource equity in 2 of those 3 tiers of schools, the additional targeted support schools, those bad achievement gap schools, and the comprehensive support schools, that the law specifically says not only do you have to recognize the resource disparities, but you must, quote, address resource disparities. Now, as Adaku mentioned, several things that those resource disparities could be. They could also be funding. And with your help at the state and local level, we can push to make sure that those resource disparities are being met. I see that my 12 minutes is now over. I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Matt Ferranti at the National Indian Education Association. Go, Matt.
Thanks, Adam. Glad to take the meat of the law, the substance of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and try to outline how you can get involved, how parents, advocates, and communities can get involved at the state level to make a difference for students that we care about. I work for the National Indian Education Association, and we focus on Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian students, and seek to move forward their educational outcomes by advocating for the over 500 tribes across the country and the students that are members of those tribes. Wanted to start just by big picture talking about the meat of the law, which is essentially a bargain for federal funding that seeks to address groups that historically have not been served well by education systems, by school districts and states. Those local entities agreed to a certain set of standards, and those standards in the Every Student Succeeds Act shift significantly to being state determined. Now that they're state determined, parent and community engagement is going to be critical, absolutely critical. So how is parent and community engagement provided for in the law? Under isESSA, a lot of the issues that were traditionally decided under No Child Left Behind under federal law have been put into yeah, no, I just saw. Perhaps you can see now my slides.
Yep.
Hang on just a sec. Okay. And that may not be the full screen, but hopefully folks can see to some extent now. Does that solve the problem, Amanda?
That looks good. What if you hit from current slide in the upper left?
I have. I've got a split screen, so I think we'll have to roll with it as is so we can get to questions, if that's okay. So I was just talking through the first point that states have a lot of authority now under the law. And Adam mentioned indicators, state goals, and timelines in the course of describing the accountability systems that are involved. And those are, states have the role of deciding those. Well, we need now to have parent and community engagement in helping those decisions at the state level to be as favorable as possible for all students and all groups of students. So the law requires that states consult, and I've identified the governor, principals, teachers, parents. In addition, representatives of Indian tribes must be consulted for the first time, and the consultation must be timely and meaningful. What we have argued in the civil rights community is for consultation to occur as early as possible, and then we want to make sure that groups and advocates and parents' voices are heard, and the final decisions that states are making are reflected in what are eventually going to be state plans. So going to the next slide, Adam mentioned accountability systems. Eventually, under isESSA, state accountability plans must be submitted to the Department of Education, who will review. This is all leading up to the 2017-2018 school year. In other words, even though the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed late last year, 2015, the law provides for a phase-in period, time for states to implement the law. And those accountability systems are going to be shaped. Some are already being shaped, and others will be altered further during the course of the state legislative sessions that will come up over the coming 9 months. So consultation is essentially is required, but there's also a provision in the law that says that states don't have to, cannot delay the implementation of their accountability plans into the 2017-18 school year because they somehow didn't do a good job of consulting with parents, advocates, principals, teachers, and tribal leaders. So how strong the consultation process is significantly up to all of us here across the country to make sure that states are actually listening to those who have a stake in the educational outcomes of our students across the country. So we're going to provide you information to engage today, but we're going to also provide these slides afterwards, as Amanda mentioned, and be available to answer any questions. And we have, as a coalition, all three of us are members of coalitions that have access to resources about each state in the country for how you could get engaged. Just mentioned state law must be changed. You'll have some time. We're here to help. There's also a provision, specific provision, that we here at NIEA are very pleased about. Local plans must consult with tribal leaders where there's a significant proportion of Native American students involved. So I'll wrap up quickly so we can get to your questions. What Adaku and Adam have talked about is the Department of Education is asking for your specific thoughts on the rules that are related to accountability system by August 1st. You can submit those yourself. You can use a template drafted by the National Women's Law Center and the National Indian Education Association. There will also be other templates that will be sent around, but those will be ready for you the week of July 18th to the 22nd. And we will make ourselves available and we can provide those templates to you. The second way that you can stay involved, this is just, if you look at this slide, this is just focusing on exactly how you can submit those comments, the website regulations.gov, and you can also go through U.S. mail to the address that's provided, and we will be sending out these slides after the webinar. So you should definitely sign up for email alerts on this subject from the National Women's Law Center. The Department of Education also has a regular listserv that will describe all of the developments on the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then I've been talking critically about getting involved in your state. So your State Department of Education's website is a good source, and then we'll provide the resources at the end of this call. I do think it's also important to understand that engaging locally is really critical because school boards will eventually have a critical role in implementing this law, and we'll want to make sure you're aware of that. So that's kind of an overview, and I think we'll want to kick it back for questions. We've covered the history and background of isESSA. We've covered the proposed rules. Adaku did that well and talked about resource equity. Adam talked about accountability in isESSA. I just finished with parent and community engagement and also how to get involved locally. And I think we'll send it back over to Amanda so that we can answer any of your questions. There's our contact information, and maybe Amanda, you can jump in.
Yes, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to all of our presenters for those fantastic presentations today. At this point, we are going to open up the floor for questions. There are a couple different ways you can submit a question. You can either enter it into your webinar toolbar, and so we can read a text question, or in your webinar toolbar, there should be a little icon that says, that looks like a raising hand. You can try to raise your hand, and that will indicate to me that you have something that you want to say over the phone. You have a question over the phone, and I can mute your or unmute your individual phone line. So we can take questions either way, and we'll just give it a second for a few to roll in. While we are waiting for questions, do we have any additional thoughts from our other presenters? No?
Amanda,
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Just real quickly, you might highlight, I think you were saying that sometime in the next 3 to 5 days, you will send out these slides just to remind everyone.
That is a good reminder. We are recording this webinar, and so we'll put that up on the Law Center's site along with a copy of the slides and some of the other resources that were mentioned here today. And so that link will go out in the next couple days, so please watch your inboxes for that. We do have a question saying, do you have any resources or deadlines for state recs or input.
I can take that one if no one else wants to. So the state deadlines for the state plan are a tough one, because technically the rules by which state plans have to be developed are still in the process of being made. They're like the public comment period ends on August 1st, and then it's going to take the department a few months in order to come up with the final rules. But at the same time, some states are already, jumping the gun and like starting drafting their rules, their state plans before the rules are actually the rules that govern those state plans are actually completed. So my best recommendation is to use one of our coalition resources to see what's going on in your own state. Pay attention to the news in your own state. If your state is already in process, the time is now. Other states, there may be a little more time. But I recommend looking on an individual state-by-state basis to see exactly what that is. We have another coalition resource, which I'm sure we'll be able to share, that I was just finished yesterday, where we have each state's contact person for who to reach out to. So hopefully that should be useful as well.
Wonderful, thanks. We have another question. What are some of the ways that isESSA implementation can collaborate with workforce systems?
Sure, this is Matt. I'll take a shot at that. I did want to mention, I think, just one timeline. I think Adam covered it as far as getting engaged with one little addition that I'd suggest, which is you should not think that it's too late by any means to be involved. And I think some advocates here in Washington are thinking that state accountability plans would have to be submitted by next year sometime around July, August, or September. So there is some time, but it's so important to engage early so that you can have some influence over the process. So be involved early, stay involved, and don't think that you're too late, because there's going to be some time to implement the regulations and to impact accountability plans.
Great
So
point, Matt. Completely agree.
Great, thank you, thank you. So then I'll just try, this workforce question is a tough one, because, and I'm sure Adam and also Adaku, both of you may have thoughts, and I think, Adaku, you may be most familiar with workforce issues of the three of us. But in isESSA, there's a provision that says that the standards for every state have to be aligned to college and career-ready standards. So that is sort of a key sweet spot where I think K-12 systems could collaborate with systems of higher education and also career and technical programs, certification programs, to try to make sure that there's a connect between getting a diploma, graduating, and having the skills to succeed in your state's system. So I think it's really important to engage and incentivize colleges and workforce training programs to make sure that they weigh in the accountability system discussion over the next 9 months to a year. And that's the best way that I think collaboration is possible. Do you want to add, either of you?
Yeah, and so as a Adaku, I'll add that in addition to what Matt said, there are several educational laws, federal educational laws, and right now folks in the House of Representatives just introduced the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, and a lot of that law is has been updated to kind of reflect isESSA, and Perkins provides funding for career and technical education programs, what was historically called vocational programs. So there is already an alignment happening between isESSA and career and technical education, and therefore workforce systems in that way.
And I'll just add that this is another great opportunity for you to reach out. One group that a stakeholder that the bill also requires states reach out to is the business community, and I think they would have an awful lot to say about this too. We don't always see eye to eye on these things, but we may see eye to eye on this issue. I'd also like to say that those indicators, where before you just had tests and grad rates, you have 2 or more potential indicators that could be used. One of them could be on career and tech. You could have, for instance, something along the lines of access to and enrollment in advanced coursework and career and tech courses. These are all things that a state could choose, and with your guidance, could choose to emphasize in their system.
Great, thank you all. I don't see any more questions. I will put out one last call for questions either through the chat function or over the phone. While we are waiting just a couple more seconds, any last thoughts from any of our presenters?
Keep an eye out in your state, what's going on. Keep an eye on your inboxes, and we'll be sharing these sorts of materials with you quite a bit going forward. And thanks for participating.
Great. I think with that note, oh, sorry, Matt, were you going to say something?
Just really briefly, I think staying involved in watching your inboxes, I think that's a great point, Adam. I think it's important both to use this resource of this overview of the law to start to build a structure in your mind of, as an advocate or as a policy person, about the law as a whole. But I also think it's important to be confident that engaging in your state is something that you can do and do well, and we will be here to support you. So I don't think that folks should feel so worried if they don't understand every last piece of the law, but we can make a huge difference, because this law is really going to be as good as we all are in pushing to make sure that the students that are at the center of each of the 3 organizations' missions are served and served well. So don't be scared or don't worry if you don't have every piece of the law at this stage. It's getting involved in your state and in your school district that is really critical.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and thanks again to all of our presenters as well as to everyone who joined us today. As a reminder, we will send out the resources within the next couple days. And also, I would encourage you, when you close out of the webinar, you will get a prompt to take just a brief survey to give us your feedback on how useful you found this, and give us any comments you might like to share. So again, thank you so much, everyone, and this concludes our webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.